Today what I thought I would do is address a bit of a debate that has emerged within the field of forest science over the last 10 or 20 years. And of course, all of you are aware of how important the topic of forest carbon and forest carbon dynamics is relative to issues of global change and climate change. But interestingly, the forest science community is quite divided when it comes to the question of what the best approach is for managing forests to enhance their role in carbon sequestration and climate mitigation. So what I want to do is address these different viewpoints that have emerged in the field. I want to provide some evidence pro and con each of those viewpoints, and then at the end I want to try to wrap all of those together and maybe propose a new approach that recognizes some compatibility, complementarity among these viewpoints. And I'll suggest at the very end that in fact these may not be in as much opposition to one another as we might think. Okay, so the context for this, of course, is the interest and the need to consider forests globally as an important carbon sink and to figure out what we can do to enhance the strength of that sink. And many of you, of course, have seen these statistics. This is a recent meta-analysis by Pan et al. Came out 2 years ago, in which they synthesized data from forests around the world. You know, and they, I guess, reiterated what we already know, that deforestation, mostly in the tropics, contributes about 15% of the total annual global greenhouse gas emissions. But considering that there is regrowth in many parts of the world, particularly in the tropics, and also reforestation occurring in much of Eastern Europe and portions of the former Soviet Union, there's some compensatory interaction there. So even though 15% of the annual emissions come from deforestation, part of that is resequestered through this regrowth. But and because of that, globally, forests remain a net carbon sink. So that's good news. So in other words, our forests globally are taking up more carbon than they are emitting. And so then the question for international carbon markets and forestry in general is how we can actually enhance the strength of that sink. And if you look at a lot of the action internationally on the international voluntary carbon markets, and of course with the California compliance cap and trade market, one of the major mechanisms that people are exploring is this idea of improved forest management. So ways in which that we can actively manage forests to enhance their capacity as a carbon sink. And that's where this debate from the forest science literature really comes in. Okay, what is the best way to actively manage forests as a carbon sink? So that's really what I'm going to address in the talk today. Okay, so there are three main viewpoints that have emerged around that question. So the first favors passive management. And the way this argument goes is that our best bet for enhancing the role of forests as a carbon sink is to conserve old-growth forests, primary forests, late successional forests, high biomass forests in general, and manage them passively, for instance, as reserves and protected areas. The second point of view is actually related to the first. These are actually not in contrast to one another. The second view is really just a variant of this one. So this one suggests that in working forests, areas that we're going to manage actively, the best way to enhance their capacity as a carbon sink is through lower impact forestry, lighter touch silviculture, reduced harvesting intensity and frequency, structural retention, these kinds of things that maintain more biomass in those forests than we would otherwise leave behind. Okay, the third point of view, though, is the polar opposite of the first two. And actually several papers have come out recently arguing this one, and so we need to address that as well. So this point of view argues that, no, we shouldn't conserve forests or manage them less intensively. What we should do, in fact, is to manage them more intensively. We We should increase harvest rates. We should increase harvest intensities. We should favor young, rapidly growing forests that we're managing over short rotations. Okay, so those are the 3 points of view that I will go through. And if you get lost at any point in the talk and you're not sure which one I'm addressing, I'll try to maintain this whole outline here at the bottom so you can keep track of which viewpoint I'm. Okay, so before I go through the science, either supporting or refuting each of those 3 viewpoints, I'm going to start with 2 slides that attempt to explain maybe the source of some of this debate and disparity. Why is it that we've reached such opposing views in the literature? Well, I'll argue that maybe one source of disparity is just simply the different scales of analysis that people have been operating at. So if we think about forest carbon accounting, which is a vastly, infinitely complex endeavor, you have to start with those basic in situ forest carbon dynamics, fluxes among pools within the forest ecosystem. That's something that we know a lot about. I mean, we've been working in that area for 30 or 40 years, so we've got that science nailed down pretty well. But now with carbon management, we have to expand our scale of analysis, right? So if we're talking about improved forest management or active forest management, now we need to think about carbon cycling into wood products. We need to think about the life cycle of those wood products as they move through the wood product stream. We need to think about indirect energy inputs that are involved in harvesting, and transporting, and processing wood products. And then tertiary sinks like landfills, fluxes from incinerators. We have to bring all of that into the analysis. So that complicates matters. But it doesn't end there, because now, of course, one thing that we're very interested in is this idea of substitution effects. That's a term you're going to hear me use a lot today. So the idea that, well, if we produce less wood, what are we going to have to use in its place? Would it be concrete, steel, plastics, other things that have a higher carbon footprint associated with them? Or can we use wood in place of fossil fuels and avoid those emissions? So we refer to all those things collectively as substitutions. So now we need to bring that into the accounting as well. But it doesn't end there either, because at some point all this becomes global in scale. Issues of leakage and geographic displacement of harvesting effects. So let's say we increase harvest rates here. Does that mean that harvest rates decrease in some other part of the world? Or vice versa? If we protect our forests in North America, are we simply displacing our harvest impacts somewhere else, which will result in the same emissions, plus the need to transport wood products to North America, which also has a carbon footprint associated with it, right? So there are these global ripple effects of geographic displacement and leakage. And understanding that becomes extremely difficult, because now you're really getting into global wood products markets and understanding market behavior, and that's not easy, because global timber markets change annually and are prone to fairly dramatic market fluctuations. So that behavior is very difficult to track and model. Today I'm just going to address some of these. I haven't done any work at the global level in terms of market behavior, although a few interesting papers have come out on this topic recently in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that I could refer you to if you're interested in. But I'm going to just address some of these accounting issues at those scales. Another source of disparity, and this one's a little bit simpler to understand. In my opinion, if you look at the literature, a lot of the disagreement simply reflects the different aspects of forest stand development that people are looking at. So as we all know, biomass or carbon sequestration changes over time as a forest develops, as it undergoes reinitiation, stem exclusion, understory reinitiation, and then old growth development. And some people really tend to focus on these earlier or younger stages of forest development during which trees are growing rapidly and rates of carbon uptake are very high. And if you just focus on that part of this SEER, it's going to give you a very different impression of carbon dynamics than if you focus on later stages of development that may have lower rates of carbon sequestration, but during which total biomass, both above ground and below ground, reach their highest levels. So we need to think about both of those, and maybe it's the different stages of focus that explain some of the confusion and disparity. Okay, so then back to the individual viewpoints. So the first one, just to refresh your memory, argues that the best way to enhance the strength of the forest carbon sink is through conservation of remaining high biomass late successional overgrowth forests, and maybe restoration of those structural conditions on some portion of the landscape. All right, so what's the science that supports this point of view? This is an interesting paper. It came out a few years ago in Nature, and it's received a lot of criticism. There's some strengths and weaknesses of this paper, but I still think it's informative and useful to begin with. This was another meta-analysis in which the authors pooled together data points from around the world. I think the green color is temperate forests and the other color are boreal forests. And these are mainly sites at which forests have been instrumented to measure carbon fluxes across the forest canopy, the eddy covariance method, for instance, gas exchange towers, canopy towers, those kinds of sites, where you get these whole ecosystem measurements of carbon dynamics. So the top figure here has net ecosystem productivity. So that represents basically net carbon uptake after you've factored out heterotrophic respiration. And this one down here is this ratio of heterotrophic respiration to net primary productivity. On this figure, as long as you're above the zero line, it basically means you're taking up more carbon than you're losing, than you're releasing through respiration, decomposition, other processes. This one down here, as long as you're above the one line, it means that you've got more fixation through NPP than you do loss from respiration, okay? And these are plotted against forest age down here on a log scale. And so what this is telling you is that these forests globally are maintaining net carbon uptake for much longer periods of time than we previously thought, into much older stand conditions than we previously would have predicted. And this is really surprising because the conventional wisdom for decades has been that old forests are dying, they're decadent, they're biological deserts, they're falling apart, all these derogatory terms that we've used to describe old growth forests for decades, and so therefore they must be carbon sources. But in fact, that doesn't appear to be the case globally. There's some variability, some variation, but on the whole, these forests are capable of maintaining positive carbon uptake for very long periods of time. There are a variety of reasons why that might be the case. I don't have time to get into that today. Part of it has to do with reallocation of biomass to below ground, really efficient partitioning of above ground growing space in old growth forests, and a variety of factors like that. Okay, but there's also some countervailing evidence that I need to recognize here. So the previous graph addresses old forests, which are primarily primary forests, or virgin forests in that case. But what about secondary forests, forests that are redeveloping on areas that have been cleared or deforested? Are those going to produce the same biomass that those primary, virgin, ancient forests, whatever you want to call them, were capable of producing in the past? Well, these are data that come from the Hubbard Brook experimental forests in New Hampshire that are really surprising, and they suggest that, well, actually, secondary forests might not have that same capacity that those primary forests did. Or maybe we're just in a whole new world and things are working differently now. So these are data from Watershed 6, which is the control watershed at Hubbard Brook that was unmanipulated, right? And they've been monitoring biomass accumulation there since the 60s. And so we've got almost 50 years of data now. And really surprising, over just the last remeasurement period, live biomass, that's what this one is, has actually not only plateaued, but actually come down in a forest that's only about 80 to 100 years old. So biomass is actually decreasing much, much earlier than we would have expected. Now why is that the case? We don't really know for sure. It probably reflects a number of stresses in the system. Acid deposition and calcium depletion, for one thing, which reduces forest productivity. Beech bark disease, which has killed off all the big old beech. Topsoil loss from erosion in the 19th century. There's even some evidence of maple decline now. So most likely this reflects the interaction of multiple anthropogenic stresses in this system. So this is global change, and this is this new world that we're in. But Hubbard Brook, just to finish the thought, and then we have to take a question, is just one data point, right? It's just one location. And what we really don't know yet is how well that's going to hold up across the Northeast. There's actually other evidence from elsewhere, Maryland and other places, that shows exactly the opposite. Forests increasing productivity. So it's a mixed bag. All right, I should move on here. So I've addressed this question. Again, we're on viewpoint number 1, the capacity of older forests, through some of my own research. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. The first is regional research within New England, and then the second is a global study. So I've looked at this question of the sort of biomass and carbon potential of old forests through my work over in the Adirondack region, the Adirondack State Park, which is a great place to study old forests because we have something like 400,000 acres of old-growth forest remaining over there, little known fact. And the old-growth stands there are not small, anomalous stands restricted to strange sites because of land use history. These are well-distributed. They transcend a wide range of geophysical diversity, so they're really representative of landscape scale diversity and provide a great place to learn about those systems. So over the course of several years, my colleagues and I have assembled a data set consisting of 29 sites. These span a range of forest ages from roughly 80 to over 400 years of age. Some examples of the forest there. And actually, this research began as a study of forest-stream interactions. We were interested in how those old-growth forests were affecting stream habitats and stream dynamics, and that's been interesting as well. But in the course of collecting those data in the forest, we were able to get some really good biomass numbers that we can use for other purposes. Okay, so we can use those field measurements to generate biomass estimates using the Jenkins et al. Allometric equations. And then we can plot those against forest age. And interestingly here, we're seeing trends that seem to support that Louisier et al. Paper, in which biomass is accumulating to much higher levels than we would have previously predicted and over much longer time frames than we might have previously predicted. We don't see any evidence of an early peak in biomass and followed by subsequent declines. There seems to be some sort of asymptotic relationship here, but we haven't necessarily even hit that maximal carrying capacity across this range of ages. And I have to be really careful in studies like this, though, because this is a chronosequence study. You know, these are just different sites at different ages. And we haven't actually tracked each site over time. So we don't know for sure what's happened to each site previously. We're just interested in this overall trend across that range of ages. And so it's informative but not definitive, put it that way. And then in a recent paper that came out in Forest Science, I pulled those data together with data contributed by a number of colleagues. And this gives us kind of a regional perspective. The problem is that for this data set, we didn't have good chronosequence data. All we had were age class data, comparing mature, which are basically middle-aged forests, against old-growth forests. But what was interesting here is that this ratio of biomass in mature to old growth remained pretty consistent throughout New England. So again, suggesting that older forests in general are able to maintain higher biomass than these middle-aged forests. Okay, so then what this research allows us to do then is to go back and revisit some of those stand development models that have been around for a long time. Like this one that many of you might be familiar with. It's the old Borman and Lichen models that was produced at Hubbard Brook back in the 70s that predicted this initial peak in biomass followed by a decline and then these theoretical steady-state dynamics. Okay, so we can now revisit that using Tom Sikkema and Tim Fahey's data that suggests, well, actually, in some cases there might be earlier declines than expected, but then in others, using our data from the Adirondacks and elsewhere, there might be the potential both for biomass accumulation of greater magnitude and of longer duration than this model might suggest. A bunch of reasons why that might be the case, why there might be these differences. And I don't have time to go through those today, but would be happy to address those later. Okay, so that was the regional example, and now I'll give you the global example. This is a project I've been working on for 4 or 5 years now. It's finally coming out in print this spring. This is a study in which we looked at temperate old-growth forests globally. So the map shows the distribution of temperate forests by latitudinal zone. So it's fairly complete, but it actually misses some of the high elevation temperate systems that you have in Central America, Northern Andes, the Ethiopian highlands, other places. So it doesn't pick those up. And then the triangles are places that we have data from, either published data from the literature or original data sets, the raw empirical data that we can pool together into this global data set. And that's what's been the real challenge in this project, just trying to standardize data at the global scale from all these different data sets. That's why it's taken so long. So the places that we have raw data from include the Pacific Northwest, Douglas fir Western hemlock forest there, coastal redwood forests in Northern California, northern hardwood forests in New England, southern beech or Nothofagus forests in Tierra del Fuego, Chile, Eucalyptus regnans forests. These are otherwise known as mountain ash forests in the Victoria Highlands of southeastern Australia. Little known trivia, this is actually the world's tallest tree. It's not redwoods. Mixed Korean pine oak systems in eastern China, and then European beech forests, Carpathian Mountains of Europe, and also the Apennine Mountains in Italy, and then temperate spruce fir forests in Central Europe, not boreal spruce fir, temperate spruce fir. So this gives me a good excuse to kind of diverge a little bit and talk about some of the work that we're doing in Ukraine. Part of the challenge assembling a global data set like this is that often you're missing data are incomplete, or you just can't use the data that are available because they've been collected in strange ways. But that gives you a good excuse to actually go to some of these places and then collect the data yourself. So I've had the opportunity to do that in the Carpathian Mountains over the last few years, and this is just an example of that. So this is the country of Ukraine. The Carpathian Mountains swing down through here, Europe's largest mountain chain, and this is just a little slice of Ukraine called Transcarpathia. Very remote, very hard to get to, but it's a fascinating place to visit because it has some of the largest remaining concentrations of old-growth forests in Europe, including this 10,000 hectare stand of European beech right there. So that's now a biosphere reserve and a World Heritage Site that I've been collecting data in, and then another reserve up here, the Gorgani Zabovidnik. So that's a spruce fir system. So there's an example of what these beech forests look like. They are absolutely magnificent. There's our friend Yuri, who was in the room a second ago. I think he just left. And here's an example of the temperate spruce fir old growth. Very reminiscent of the Pacific Northwest in a lot of ways in terms of its structure. One of the interesting aspects of doing this kind of work, and in this case working alongside some Ukrainian scientists and forest rangers, is they just have a completely different way of inventorying forests and doing forest mensuration than we do. And so, you always have to start with a little bit of discussion, maybe even some argumentation until you agree on a method that you can move forward with. And so culturally, that's kind of been an interesting aspect of this research. Okay, so now we can finally take all those data and pool them together, and that's what I'm going to show you here. And I'm just going to give you one example using 4 regions instead of all of those regions to make it a little bit clearer and easier to understand. Okay, so this is an ordination using a technique called non-metric multi-dimensional scaling. This is a very robust type of ordination. It's non-parametric. There's no assumption of normality, and it yields very clear results. So for those of you that are not familiar with ordination, it's basically a way of putting a whole bunch of variables into the mix, in this case different aspects of forest structure, including biomass, and then looking at how these different sites that you sampled cluster together or disperse in ordination space. So if they're closer together, it means that they're more similar ecologically, and if they're spread apart, it means they're dissimilar. Okay? So we can look at that clumping now, and so we'll do European old growth, European mature, U.S. old growth, U.S. mature, Pacific Northwest, old growth, Pacific Northwest mature, and then Chile. I only have data on old growth forests there. Okay, so what does this tell us? It tells us that there's certainly a wide range of variation globally. There's some spread here. There are a lot of differences among these systems. But there's also a fair amount of overlap right here in the middle. Some global commonality that's interesting. So the question is, what explains that commonality? So for that, you need a post hoc analysis. This is a Kendall's tau, where you look at which variables explain that similarity the most strongly. And the variable that floats to the top, that has the highest ranking here, is live above ground biomass. So what this suggests is that despite all that variability globally, the one thing these systems share in common is a really high level of biomass. So that, again, supports this argument that if we conserve those forests, we can store a lot of biomass in them, and carbon, that would otherwise be released to the atmosphere if they were cleared or logged. And you can also look at the same data as a chronosequence, and it just supports the arguments that I've already made. You can add in China here. So similar trends over time. Okay, I'm going to skip this one in the interest of time. So and I've already used most of my time, and I'm only through viewpoint. So maybe we'll do like part 1 of the talk today, part 2 some other time. All right, so that's all well and good, right? It suggests that the carbon in old growth forests is like money in the bank, right? If you conserve those forests, you're preventing that carbon from being released to the atmosphere. The countervailing argument, though, that some people make is, if we start protecting all these forests that would otherwise have been logged, are we just displacing that logging somewhere else? That leakage effect that we talked about before. And that's why in carbon markets, for instance, there's so much interest in trying to get a handle on those leakage effects and making sure that we account for those. Easier said than done. Competing viewpoint number 2. This is the one that argues for active management, but a lower impact management, right? Increased post-harvest structural retention, leaving some stuff behind, and extending our rotation periods or lessening our harvest frequency. Okay, so my lab has looked at this question using data from the Northeast again, and this is a selection of forest inventory and analysis plots. We stratified New England by ecoregion, we applied a whole bunch of site matching criteria, and this ended up giving us 32 stands across this area that met our criteria. Took the data from those sites and fed them into a forest development simulator called the Forest Vegetation Simulator, FVS. And we used the northeastern variant of that. This is an individual tree model. And then we applied a number of different management scenarios that reflect different degrees of structural retention, or you could call that harvesting intensity, and different rotation periods. So some scenarios were really intense harvesting with short rotations, and other scenarios were very light harvesting and long rotations, and then everything in between. So we can demarcate that full spectrum of forest management alternatives. Okay? Project those forward in time, 160 years, which is basically 2 even age rotations in Vermont. And we'll see what the model predicts. Okay, so we'll start with the no management scenario. So this is what would happen if we didn't harvest these stands and we just let them grow. And then at the bottom here, we'll add the most intense management scenario. So this is clear cutting over short rotations, right? And then we'll just gradually add scenarios here, and as we walk up through this sequence, harvest intensity is decreasing, so we're cutting them less intensively, and rotation period is increasing, so harvest frequency is decreasing. And what you'll see then is that this moves us higher and higher on this biomass axis, if you think about the average amount of carbon that these forests are storing over time. And by the way, this y-axis here includes both the carbon in the forest as well as carbon that's transferred to wood products and the life cycle of the carbon through those wood products. Okay? So another way of looking at these scenarios then, we'll just collapse it all down to some simple averages. The average amount of carbon in these different pools over 160 years. And then this axis is just that same spectrum of management intensities we looked at before. And it suggests that as management intensity decreases and harvesting frequency increases also, you add this kind of marginal benefit in terms of average carbon storage over time. So that's really interesting, and it seems to support this view then that if we reduce our harvesting intensity, we're going to maintain higher levels of carbon in these forests. Now the message here for forest managers and for landowners is not that you have to stop managing your forest, that you have to use this no management or passive management scenario. Instead, it's that you have a range of options available. And as you move along this continuum, you're going to gradually increase the average amount of carbon that your forests are going to store. So this gives you some flexibility under carbon market protocol that are really interested in those sorts of options, those improved forest management options.
Hey Bill?
Yes?
Can you talk just for a second about what you assume the wood becomes? Because it seems like that harvested products thing must drive a lot of this.
It does, although it's not as consequential as you might think.
Wow.
I think people have always thought that it would be, that a lot of that wood would be in the wood products pool. It turns out to not be that significant. And the reason is that most wood products harvested in North America have a fairly short lifespan.
They go in paper or they get burned or what?
Both. But even saw logs and veneer grade logs don't remain in use for as long as you might think, with exceptions like houses and furniture, but so much of what we produce is used for other types of products. Construction forming materials and pallets and other things. So when you look at the life cycle data, only 10% of a tree's carbon remains in use after 60 years, okay, on average. The model calculates different types of product pools, saw logs, veneer logs, pulp logs, so it's all in there.
And they all have like an assumed decomposition
They all have
rate.
different life cycle and decomposition rates. I just wanted to point out that another aspect of this research has looked at other co-benefits that we might accrue if we manage for high biomass levels in these forests. So back to that forest-stream interaction work in the Adirondacks, we've been able to show that, well, as above ground biomass increases in this forest, things like woody debris recruitment into streams, and then the complexity of these stream habitats also increases. That's actually a really important ecological co-benefit then that goes along with managing for biomass. And then on this idea of co-benefits and trade-offs and multiple objectives, maybe trying to make this a little more realistic in terms of the considerations that landowners in the Northeast would actually have. That's something that Terry Donovan and Scott Schwank and I have looked at. This came out recently. And this used some biodiversity modeling that Terry had done, that we actually did together. We had occupancy models for bird species generated from something like 500 sample points across northern New England. And we basically collapsed those down into a number of indicator species. Each indicator species is for a different successional guild or different type of habitat condition. And then we could tie the predicted occupancy, or think of that as habitat value for these different types of communities, to a simulation model that then predicted the relative abundance of those different types of habitat over time, moving into the future. Okay, and then we can look at different forest management scenarios, just like we did in that previous exercise, And then we can predict the relative utility of different forest management approaches at providing habitat for these different types of species. And now if we've done that, we can actually look at trade-offs between biodiversity, in this case using birds, timber, in terms of simulated timber harvest and revenue, and then carbon, just like we did in that previous study. And then using a multi-criteria analysis, you can kind of rank these different scenarios based on their relative utility at providing multiple objectives or multiple benefits. And to make a long story short, it tells us what we probably could have guessed in the first place, that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, that does everything well. You really need a combination of approaches out there on the landscape to provide different types of uses and objectives in different mixes. So we're getting to the point where we can take some of this research and then we can integrate it with some of these other objectives that landowners have in the real world, right? Because that's what you're going to need to make this actually work on the ground. Okay, so that's all well and good as well, but if we reduce harvesting intensity, we have that same problem of leakage and geographic displacement that we had with the first viewpoint. So I don't need to say anything more about that. I'm just trying to recognize that there are these trade-offs, these limitations with any one of these approaches. Okay, computing viewpoint number 3. Again, argues the absolute opposite of the first two. This one is suggesting that we should increase harvesting intensity and we should achieve through that this substitution benefit by substituting woody biomass for fossil fuels and avoiding those fossil fuel emissions, substituting wood products for other types of building materials that have a higher carbon footprint associated with their production, and that this is the best way to achieve a net reduction in emissions, right? All right, well, let's look at the evidence in support of that. Actually, there are really only a handful of studies in the peer-reviewed literature that have evaluated this question. Lots of people talk about it in the forestry community, but to my knowledge, there's only 4 or 5 papers that have actually been peer-reviewed on this. And a lot of them go back to a fairly limited study, this one right here, that was done in Minnesota, where they analyzed the carbon footprint or the emissions associated with basically 2 different houses that were built. One using wood products and the other built with concrete and steel. And they quantified those emissions, and they were able to show that, yeah, certainly these other products have a much higher emissions profile than does wood. But just keep in mind that, again, it's a fairly limited study, and so our ability to extrapolate from that is somewhat limited. Okay, but then you can start thinking about substitution effects, and we could think about a forest management scenario like this one. So here you have a forest here at the bottom that's growing, maybe it had a thinning, and then another partial harvest here, regeneration harvest here, et cetera, et cetera. So you've got the carbon that's in the forest, right? At each harvest, some of that carbon is transferred into wood products, and then it has a life cycle there. But then look at this one up here. This is the substitution effect. So this is trying to quantify those avoided emissions had you used some other type of building material. So this is kind of like funny money, right? It's not real. It's what would have happened had you not done something, right? What they're saying is that every time we use wood instead of something else, we're achieving these substitution benefits here. We're avoiding emissions. And those substitution effects slowly accrue over time until at some point they actually exceed the total amount of biomass that you could store even in an unmanaged forest. And this is what gets our forestry community really excited, right? Because they think, wow, these substitution effects are really large. And that's probably real. That's probably an important thing to consider. So there's certainly some merit to that argument. On the other hand, there's still a lot of uncertainty. Again, the papers that have been published are fairly simple in that they assume this kind of one-to-one substitution rate. So that, if we produce 1 unit volume less of wood, we're going to have to substitute an equal volume of something else. But as Josh pointed out earlier, that's not really the way markets behave, right? You've got supply and demand curves. If supply decreases, then you guys tell me what happens. Price increases, right? And so then Demand might then decrease as well, or other ways markets respond is by increasing efficiencies or increasing recycling and reuse. So this is probably a little too simple. So more work is needed. And then there's also this question of how markets are really going to respond globally. You know, God forbid, maybe people would build smaller houses or something like that. You know, so we're not really sure how the substitution would play out. And then there are also some fundamental differences among different forest types in terms of the substitution effects that we might expect. That's what this paper from Scandinavia is showing. Okay, so certainly some pros and cons to that argument, and we need to think about it. I am almost out of time here, and I want to talk a little bit about the final substitution effect, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is biomass energy. And that's something that my lab has been working on a lot in the last couple of years. I'm thinking that in the interest of time, maybe I'll save this to another talk, or maybe I can bring it into the discussion at the end if people have questions. Okay, so I promised you that I would try to tie it all together at the very end, and that's what I'm going to attempt to do right now. Okay, so we clearly have three different points of view here, and two of which are at least diametrically opposed to one another. Why might that be the case? Well, in my opinion, part of this is almost ideological in origin and reflects viewpoints that have been around in the forest science community for a long time. I mean, think back to the spotted owl and the old growth battles in the late 80s and early 90s. We had exactly the same debate back then. Some people were arguing that the best way to conserve the owl was by protecting old growth forests. Other people were arguing, no, we don't need new protected areas or reserves. We can actively manage every inch of the landscape to provide those same habitat conditions. Okay, that was late 80s, early 90s. Since then, I think we've developed a more sophisticated understanding of those kinds of issues. And we recognize now that really sustainable forestry is kind of this continuum of options, you know, ranging from strictly protected reserves at this end of the continuum to actively managed industrial forests, certified forests over here, and then everything in between. If you think about the IUCN protected areas categories, for instance, they incorporate that sort of spectrum, that range of opportunities there. And so this was a view that I tried to articulate in a paper published a few years ago, that in fact these ideologies are not necessarily opposed to one another. They might just represent different points along this continuum. And really what we need to think about is that overall mix of strategies that we have out there on the landscape to achieve different benefits and different types of objectives, right? And if we look at how the forest carbon debate is playing out, it pretty much aligns itself exactly along that same spectrum. And dare I say that individual people are actually still in the same places along that spectrum that they were 20 years ago. So we've got option one kind of over here at the protected areas end of the spectrum. We've got option two here in the middle in this kind of like sustainably managed forest, certified forest, middle ground in the spectrum. And then we've got option three over here at this kind of industrial forestry, active management end of the spectrum. So maybe what we can conclude then is that these are not necessarily opposed, they are simply points along this continuum, and we might think about ways in which these could work together, okay, to achieve different ends. Well, what would it take to make that work? And I think this is my final slide. It's going to take a new generation of carbon models that is spatially explicit, that can track individual stands over time, and can simulate these multiple management options, these different scenarios. And if we can do that kind of accounting, we can probably optimize the way in which we manage large forests, both for carbon as well as for these other co-benefits. Again, using a range of different strategies. And that kind of analysis is just beginning to happen. You can look at the Canadian carbon budget model, that's this one here, which basically allows you to do just that. There are others like the Landscape Management System, LMS, out of Yale, and others as well. So I think that this is getting us to where we need to be, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Okay, and with that, thank you very much. And,
well, let me put a real-life screen on the substitution. I'm on the electric board, Burlington Electric. You know about the power plant. The last 2 days, I got some stuff from Josh Schlossberg, who's concerned about the impacts of harvesting forestry, especially for bringing them up. So the substitution effect is basically what we run half of our electric system on in Burlington, and so I'm really interested in that. So that's the part I was waiting for today. And so I'm casting my vote right now for you to come back.
Could I use that as an excuse to actually show a couple of those slides?
Yeah, fine with me.
All right, well, thanks for asking that question. Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more. It's a fascinating question. So this is another huge debate, right? Is biomass energy carbon neutral or not? And many of you are probably familiar with that Manomet study that came out of Massachusetts, in which a study for the state of Massachusetts, in which they concluded that it really isn't carbon neutral. But their particular model suggested that if you start cutting down forests and burning the wood as biomass, there's going to be an initial flux of carbon to the atmosphere. And it's going to take some time, decades to 100 years, to either resequester that through forest regrowth or to offset enough fossil fuel emissions to achieve a net emissions benefit. And the reason you don't offset fossil fuel emissions as fast as you might have thought is that wood is a lot less efficient as an energy source than fossil fuels. We just got to, let's face it, it has a lot more emissions per unit of energy than does fossil fuels, right? So that was the Manomet model. It received a lot of criticism, though, because it didn't do a good job of handling real landscapes. In their model, all the forests are cut at the same time, and then they all regrow at the same time. My lab decided to take a crack at this, and we wanted real data on carbon fluxes from bioenergy harvests. So we actually went out and sampled 35 bioenergy harvests across the Northeast. We quantified the actual carbon fluxes coming off of these operations, including all the direct and indirect emissions. And this gave us a pretty good handle on those initial carbon fluxes, and we could show that, yeah, actually, you've got a lot of flux coming off of whole tree harvesting, maybe not quite as much off of non-whole tree harvest bioenergy operations, but still a little bit more than conventional harvest.
So the negative sign means?
That means there's been a net flux of carbon to the atmosphere, okay? So we've got some real data, and then we plug that back into the simulator, but in this case, applied to 360 sites across the Northeast, and then projected 160 years in the future. And this slide over here showed you how incredibly complicated the carbon accounting was to track all those different carbon fluxes in the forest, in the wood products, indirect emissions from transport harvesting, energy capture, all these different things, right? Then at the end of 160 years, you can say, all right, this is the average amount we have either stored or sequestered or emitted directly or indirectly, okay? So that's very interesting. And then coming back to the million-dollar question, is bioenergy carbon neutral or not? I'll tell you where I'm at with that. And I can't say that this is definitive. But I think that it comes down to what you use as your baseline, what you're comparing against. Okay? So in this simulation here, you've got that kind of net benefit, the net flux here, which basically, if you're in positive territory, it means we're adding more carbon than we're emitting. And if we drop below this line here, it means we're emitting more than we're adding, right? This is stored or avoided, okay? What this is showing us is that all of these bioenergy scenarios, these are different levels of bioenergy harvest applied to different proportions of the landscape, and the harvests are staggered over time and space, like a real landscape works. You know, so that you might have one stand that's cut over here and emitting carbon, but meanwhile you have another stand over here that's regrowing and resequestering and maybe offsetting that site over here, right? So this simulates the way a real landscape works. But all of these bioenergy scenarios keep you in positive territory. In other words, you're adding or avoiding more emissions than you had at time zero, at the starting point. So if your baseline is what we're doing now, they're all beneficial, right? But there's a completely different way of looking at it. So what if your baseline is the emissions that would have happened under business as usual if we hadn't harvested wood for bioenergy at all? That's the zero line here. This is the non-bioenergy scenario that we modeled. Conventional logging that doesn't produce bioenergy. All of the bioenergy scenarios ended up emitting more carbon than business as usual. Which suggests that maybe we shouldn't produce wood for bioenergy at all. Well, there's an inflammatory statement, controversial, right? But it all depends on the baseline. If business as usual is your baseline, then you might come to that conclusion. But if you're interested in maybe not increasing emissions over what we're doing now and achieving other benefits that wood energy gives you, right? Like it's local, it's renewable, it reduces our dependence on foreign oil, then maybe this kind of baseline is acceptable.
It's interesting, this discussion actually, I can see some parallels into discussions around local food systems. You know, do we take advantage of the economies of scale of industrial food production and actually get food to a consumer at less CO2? You know, but there are all these other things that you mentioned that you have to bring into the conversation, resilient local economies. And carbon's only, you know, a piece of that, a piece of the bioenergy. Sort of.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, with crop-based biofuels, you're into those trade-offs with food production, of course, right? With forestry, also trade-offs, but slightly different mix of trade-offs. Yeah.
Can I ask a very specific question? How big are those numbers in pink as a fraction of tons per hectare generally? Is that a big difference between 0 and 10 tons per hectare,
well,
or is that like a 2% difference?
So this number here is actually the average annual difference. So if you think about, and it's on a per hectare basis, so a hectare is not a very large area. So what we're saying is that per hectare, every year on average, this scenario is emitting this much more than that scenario.
Yeah.
So then extrapolated over a long period of time and across a large landscape, that can really add up.
How many tons are on a hectare of northeast forest? What's a standing stock?
Of carbon, 150 megagrams per hectare on average.
So that's like
that's
1/30th. 5 is like a 30th of the standing stock.
That's definitely small, but you know, could add up over time.
No kidding.
Over a large area.
But let's all thank Bill for coming here.
Thank you.